Hey, Cypher here with a review of The Last Duel. It is surprisingly good, though a little long in the tooth, as director Ridley Scott keeps doing recently. One of the key issues with medieval depictions is that they tend to modernize society, completely removing the story from their supposed basis. To be sure, this movie does do a bit of that, but it also depicts the interpersonal conflict, misogyny, and strange litigiousness of medieval society quite well. First and foremost, though, they show what a judicial duel was. Dueling has an interesting history, and while this was the last judicial one in France, there is a much more expansive context that precedes and follows the events depicted in this film. This episode is sponsored by patrons like Kevin Butler and Precedes Watches. They make military-inspired watches with some history behind them. The one I got is modeled after the A11, known as the watch that won the war, for its common usage throughout World War II among the Allies. They've updated the design a bit, making the dial larger, using sapphire glass, non-radioactive glow-in-the-dark paint, and having a smooth moving second hand. It also comes with a warranty tag that King Richard I clearly approves of. He also likes the packaging, apparently. They dedicated these to veterans, such as Tom Rice, who jumped out of a C-47 during Operation Overlord. As the cadence goes, he went to stand up, hook and shuffle to the door, jump right out on the count of 4. Having done so, he got caught on the side of the plane when his hook didn't release, thereby ripping the watch from his arm and possibly saving his hand from further injury. Luckily, he didn't experience the rest of that cadence, which goes, "If my chute don't open wide, I've got a spare one on my side. If that one don't open too, look out below 'cause I'm coming through." Rice made it down with a scraped arm and continued the fight, even jumping again later that year, suffering severe wounds from the enemy and rejoining in early 45. And in a coincidental connection to this episode, Rice's memoir is titled Trial by Combat. So these watches have a pretty good story behind them. Y'all know that I care a great deal about veterans issues, so you'll be glad to hear that Precedes donates a portion of their revenue to veterans charities. So check them out by clicking the link below. Thanks, and on with the show. From time immemorial, warriors of all sorts trained for combat by dueling one another. Inevitably, this turned into fighting for pride and sport. Pistol dueling was even an Olympic sport in 1908, where they'd shoot actual guns with wax bullets at one another. But there's still plenty of other examples like fencing and wrestling. Dueling was the mainstay of gladiatorial combat, which was the most popular form of entertainment in Roman times. So there's always been that kind of dueling, but the actual fight to the death in order to decide something has a history to it. Since ancient times, we have stories of single combat, where armies would choose to send champions to fight one another instead of engaging in pitched battles. Perhaps the most famous of these is David versus Goliath in the Bible, but there are earlier references in Egyptian legend from the 19th century BC. These duels came in numerous forms, and they often were non-binding, but they continued into medieval times. It was commonplace in Japan until the Edo period that began in 1603, and Kerala, India had a ritualized form that lasted into the 19th century. A breakaway form of this was the Norse holmgang. Basically, any man could challenge another to single combat. It was a means of halting a feud before it developed into open warfare. While the record of holmgangs is fairly sparse, it's clear that this form of dueling goes back to prehistoric times in Scandinavia. As numerous tribes migrated from the region during the Volkerwanderungen of post-Roman Empire Western Europe, they brought this form of dueling with them and codified it into Germanic law. As the church tried to assert moral authority over violence, they transformed challenges to single combat into trial by combat. Numerous other types could be performed by the priestly class, called trials by ordeal, and judicial duels were simply lumped in with the rest of them. Basically, some form of torture would be inflicted upon a defendant, and if they survived it, clearly God had smiled upon them, thereby declaring their innocence. Catholic clergy took part in these trials until its abolition for them in 1215 AD, but secular authority continued them in various forms for centuries later. The ordeal of trial by combat was seen as a way in which God ordained the winner of the duel as being considered correct. Judicial duels were uncommon, but a legal form of solving a contested suit, especially when evidence was lacking. Steadily, judicial duels became less popular in the late Middle Ages. The last one fought in France was 1386. The Holy Roman Empire and Italian states mostly ended theirs in the 16th century, and Great Britain had a few as late as the 17th century. Instead, trial by jury became much more popular than ordeals, where you had to survive something to prove your innocence, or bench trials, where whoever presided over the court, such as a monarch, lord, or judge, pronounced the ruling on the case. Trial by combat remained on the books for numerous countries, but was generally unused, forming a kind of pre-modern relic. It wasn't formally abolished before the US gained independence, so there have been a few attempts at requesting this kind of trial, but none granted. Though there's of course this one.
Let's have trial by combat!
But duels did not end with trials by jury. Affairs of honor seem to have boiled up alongside judicial duels. Especially during the Renaissance, dueling became a way to address perceived wrongs and establish one's social status. As early as 1410, Code Duellos, or codes for dueling, were published, but they were fairly loose at first. For instance, a duel between 13 French and 13 Italian knights was fought on the 13th of February, 1503. That's essentially a skirmish, not a duel. So duels became more ritualized over time, formalizing many of the same routines of trial by combat. One made a challenge by dropping a gauntlet or slapping someone with a glove.
I challenge you to a duel.
I accept.
They require seconds to attempt dissuading the combatants and make sure the rules were followed. Weapons and methodologies were chosen ahead of time and strictly adhered to. The classic weapons were swords, of course, but there were plenty of weird ones, such as billiard balls or balloons and blunderbusses. The Code Duello ruled over these affairs of honor and became increasingly popular throughout Europe. By the 18th century, people were beginning to see the duel as an abhorrent institution and entirely uncivilized.
So uncivilized.
Massachusetts outlawed it in 1728. George Washington forbade it in his Continental Army, though there were some duels. There was even a proposed U.S. constitutional amendment in 1838, so the federal government could enforce a prohibition. But dueling remained prominent throughout the early 19th century. President Jackson might have fought as many as 100 in his lifetime. It was particularly prominent in honor societies like the aristocratic South, and migrated to the West, where it became the stuff of legend. France kept dueling popular well into the 20th century, though they became increasingly less lethal. The last duel there was in 1967, and the last to use lethal force was in Uruguay a few years later. Dueling is not necessarily a thing of the past, since we still have people challenging each other to a fight, but the ritualized sense of the term is long gone. This movie follows the last judicial duel in France, which was fought to decide a rape charge between two rivals. They'd been bickering in court over lands and favoritism, and then the rape of Marguerite de Carrouges probably happened. Jacques Le Gris, the alleged rapist, managed to draw first blood, but Jean de Carrouges ultimately won the duel. This was the plot of a namesake nonfiction novel. While it contextualizes the history a bit, the book is severely lacking in any kind of primary source analysis. The author is a literary critic by training, and it shows. He makes many definitive statements when the 5 medieval accounts he draws upon either contradict each other, or sometimes one is clearly better than the others. So while the book is fun, it makes several crucial mistakes that get replicated in the film. But they also clearly brought in some experts, and found at least one named Laurie Chevalier listed in the credits. He's a professor in France, so that probably helped a bit, and in most ways the film is exceptionally good. What makes this film great is the level of nuance they're willing to bring to the topic. For instance, we understand a lot about gender dynamics here.
I'll have that piece of land as well.
Most certainly.
This scene depicts a dowry negotiation, and Marguerite is right there while they callously discuss what she is worth. There's a lot about the legal wrangling over what constitutes a rape, and it is quite foreign to us today, but fairly accurate to then.
Of course, she made the customary protest, but she is a lady. It was not against her will.
One can only come to the conclusion she must have dreamt it.
Formally, this is not about her. Rape is not a crime against a woman. It is a property crime against her male guardian.
I have no legal standing without your support.
And you shall have it. I will not allow him to be the last man to have known you.
They hint at the possibility that most women would not bring charges of rape because of these conditions.
I was raped. And despite my protestations and my revulsion, did I go crying to my lord? I had better things to worry about. No, I stood up, got on with my life.
There's even a bit about how physicians believed a female orgasm was the only way to conceive a baby.
It is imperative that you have a pleasurable conclusion similar to your husband's in order to conceive a child.
Or perhaps you cannot be pleased.
A rape cannot cause a pregnancy. This is just science.
The filmmakers kinda make it sound like the misconception is based on some kind of idea of female frigidity, but that's a Victorian misconception, not a medieval one. Men at the time constantly feared how lascivious women were, quite the opposite of the film's depiction, but that's a minor issue. Another fascinating part of this film is that it shows the buildup of tensions between Le Gris and Carrouges. We see the various slights both of them perceived, and how pride drove their actions.
This was meant to be part of Marguerite's dowry. Pierre simply gave it to you.
In appreciation of my service.
You will be the new captain at Belém.
Carrouges will be furious.
I am lost. They tell me I'm to leave here within a month.
I say to you whatever I like. I decide who's the captain at Belém.
That sycophant. Sycophants all! I will sue you for this!
Now that's some good stuff. Ridley Scott split the narrative between the two challengers, Marguerite and the duel itself. I honestly think this is unnecessary and could have been arranged better, but for the most part, it works to convey that there are multiple perspectives to this. The main thing is, we get a good sense of the period and how the aristocracy worked. For instance, Carrouges is shown struggling to pay for his life, and that Le Gris gained favor through his accounting ability. But especially the namesake of the film is where it goes particularly astray from history. The duel itself is nothing like the account we have of it. While they contradict one another in some particulars, they speak in unison with what weapons were selected. There's nothing about using axes, and only the most distant source even speaks of a singular joust, not what's depicted. They probably didn't have enough space in the enclosure. The enclosure itself is well understood and definitely not similar. No horse got killed during combat either. Finally, the helmets they have on are silly. It's some kind of movie contrivance to show the actors' faces. No, that's not the way they were. But who cares, right? None of that affects the narrative whatsoever. The outcome is the same. Carrouges won with a leg wound, and Le Gris got dragged off to the gibbet. Another minor thing that's of no consequence, but I have to at least mention it, is that they show Notre Dame under construction, even though it was already complete by then. There's a couple peripheral details that bug me though. First, they accurately describe the penalty for making noise.
It is strictly prohibited, on pain of death and the loss of property.
Which is line for line from the book. This was to protect against the crowd casting curses, and therefore intervening with God's judgment. Remember, this whole thing is predicated on God's judgment being rendered through this duel. After all, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. But the movie shows the crowd cheering and even the then 18-year-old king rooting them on. So the movie contradicts itself here. Then there's the depiction of Marguerite being in the ring. It even appears that they have wood ready to light the tower on fire. Now that's ridiculous. If she was there, and we have conflicting information on that, she would have been among the nobility on the stand. Also, in all likelihood, the threat to her life for perjury was an exaggeration, as was routine at the time. While punishments could be, well, medieval, they were used more often as deterrents. Executions for perjury were typically only meted out for charges that the king or lord found particularly egregious, and this didn't qualify. Finally, there's one issue about the formatting of this story that goes well beyond the problems of its basis. You see this? I get that the film is trying to be all feminist here, by saying believe women or whatever, but we don't have Marguerite's testimony. The whole point of doing a Rashomon-style narrative, with multiple conflicting perspectives, is to avoid being definitive. Doesn't matter what social justice cause it's in service of, if you are blatantly fictionalizing and acting like it's the absolute truth, that is knowingly dispensing falsehoods, which is called lying. Now, I think this is easy to ignore, but it undermines the authorial intent significantly. Luckily, I don't care about his intent, and it's easy to correct. See? I fixed your movie. These issues are all pretty minor, and besides the last one, they don't affect the narrative. Even the omissions don't matter. For instance, it would have been pretty interesting to see Le Gris getting knighted, since they wanted the combatants to be of equal rank. So they knighted him just before the duel. Or on the grounds, we could have seen them giving oaths, thereby declaring what they contested by swearing that their claim was correct, and that they'd fight fairly before God. That would have been fun to watch, since they were holding hands while making those oaths. It'd be a great way to heighten the drama. Still, it's a good film with an excellent look into medieval society.
Yes, we're talking about your time. Can I get a kitty kiss? Thank you. That's more like it. It's a good boy. Mwah.
The Code Duello ruled over these affairs of honor. The Code Duello, Carrouges is shown